talk, I aim to present Emily Dickinson as a poet who is an experiential Daoist. That is, her poetry accords with various aspects of Daoist thinking independently of it, as she is unlikely ever to have read such works as the Tao Te Ching or the Zhuangzi in translation, and she possibly had never even heard of Taoism. I am going to present a reading here of Dickinson which stresses her heterodoxy in the world of 19th century Christian New England. I see her work as providing one of the most powerful poetic treatments of a sense of world and the transcendent as being inextricably intertwined, the ancient and necessary sense of being in the world that Taoism stresses and modernity has done its best to extirpate along with the world. In an early poem, Dickinson considers all the infant mortality in nature, a consideration which, a little earlier in the 19th century, had contributed to Darwin's understanding of natural selection. In this poem she writes of sparrows unnoticed by the father, lambs for whom time had not a fold. These are very bold words because they directly contradict two important passages in the Gospels. But Dickinson is bold. In another poem she describes herself as the Queen of Calvary, and in another she dismisses the usual Christian solace for suffering. I reason that in heaven somehow it will be even, some new equation given, but what of that? And later she aligns herself with witchcraft, which, bearing in mind the New England witch trials of the 17th century, was no metaphor to be used flippantly even 200 years later. Witchcraft was hung in history, but history and I find all the witchcraft that we need around us every day. And in another poem she writes, "Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome." All these poems tend to support the idea of a well-informed Dickinson treading the outer edges of Christianity without too much regard for whether she passed beyond. I think that she also wrote many poems when an alternative is pretty plainly set out, and that this alternative is very similar to Taoist thinking. For example, in this famous poem, she explicitly echoes the Taoist emphasis on emptiness as a precondition for being in accord with the way. "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody, how public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog." Just as an aside, you can see from the appearance of the text how eccentric Dickinson's manuscripts are, punctuated erratically with dashes and with equally erratic capitalisation. Although there isn't usually a problem in understanding them when you read them out loud. Poets, and I take this from my own practice as a poet, as well as knowledge of other poets' practices, tend to find first drafts which are very like Dickinson's, and later turn these into more finished products. As far as I know, Emily Dickinson is unique amongst major poets in English in leaving her manuscripts in this state, not taking them further. And in this I would liken her practice to the impromptu words which pour forth every day and harmonise within the framework of nature. In chapter 26 of the Zhuangzi, in Mayer's translation, so vital is their inspiration. To return to Dickinson's poems demonstrating a similarity with Daoist ideas, earlier than the frog poem she had written a poem which perfectly encapsulates the Daoist concept of ziran, or self-so. That is, every living thing has its own nature, which it follows in accordance with the way. "A burdock clawed my gown, not burdock's blame, but mine, who went too near the burdock's den." And here is a later poem that she wrote that so perfectly reflects this idea it could have been written by Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi. "Nature is what we see. the hill, the afternoon, squirrel, eclipse, the bumblebee. Nay, nature is heaven. Nature is what we hear, the bobolink, the sea, thunder, the cricket. Nay, nature is harmony. Nature is what we know, yet have no art to say, so impotent our wisdom is to her simplicity. The bobolink, a small American passerine, often pops up in Dickinson's poetry, and later she identifies herself with this bird in one poem as the rowdy of the meadow. It is sadly inevitable that I have to report to you that the bobolink has declined in recent years, owing to habitat changes in its North American breeding areas, fewer damp meadows, and habitat loss in its Central and South American wintering grounds. Dickinson foresaw this. No bobolink reversed his singing when the only tree he minded occupying by the farmer bee close to the root. Of course, among the 1700 poems in her collected poems, there are many which are faultlessly Christian orthodox. But the ones that I have read already are so striking and so clearly unorthodox that, as it were, they trump the others. They are also all of an inspired quality, which not all the orthodox are, and seem to come naturally from her rather than being written from duty. I'm going to read 5 more poems now and discuss them. This one is concerned with living in the moment. Forever is composed of nows. 'Tis not a different time, except for infiniteness and latitude of home. From this, experienced here, remove the dates. To these, let months dissolve in further months, and years exhale in years. Without debate or pause or celebrated days, no different our years would be from Anno Domini's. This poem begins with the author talking about a transcendent time, but then circles back and notes our years are no different from Anno Domini. That is, the awareness of the way can be experienced in everyday life and constantly throughout conscious life. It is interesting that she writes, let months dissolve in months, and years exhale in years. We might have expected her to write expire in years, but this parallels the emphasis in some Daoist writings in breathing control, and I expect she had independently discovered breathing exercises for herself. This next one, like the frog poem, is about emptiness. There is another loneliness that many die without. Not want of friend occasions it, or circumstance of lot, but nature sometimes thought, and whoso it befall is richer than could be revealed by mortal numeral. How amusing the first 2 lines are, because the author, having mentioned loneliness, might be expected to write that many die of, but instead writes that many die without, standing the expected meaning, loneliness is a bad thing, on its head. This one is about nature and enlightenment. In many and reportless places we feel a joy. Reportless also, but sincere as nature or deity. It comes without a consternation, dissolves the same, but leaves a sumptuous destitution without a name. Profane it by a search we cannot, it has no home, nor we who having once inhaled it, thereafter roam. Note once again the idea of breathing, we who have once inhaled it, as associated with the way. In the 1890s, some years after Dickinson's death, an American scientist noted the odour of earth after rain, which I take it is what this poem is about, and theorised that it had to do with oils from plants settling in the soil and being released with the rain. In the 1960s, 2 Australian scientists independently described it and gave it a name, petrichor, although our author had described it pretty plainly a century before. This next poem is about the worldliness of experience. The fact that earth is heaven, whether heaven is heaven or not, if not an affidavit of that specific spot, not only must confirm us that it is not for us, but that it would affront us to dwell in such a place. And the final poem is about the fellowship of humans with the 10,000 things, the biota. The most important population unnoticed dwell. They have a heaven each instant, not any hell. Their names, unless you know them, 'twere useless to tell. Of bumblebees and other nations, the grass is full. It is also possible to trace what I've just traced in the poems, that is, a Daoist style sensibility dwelling within a context that should by all rights be exclusively Christian, and existing as contrary to that Christianity in her letters. Here Emily is writing to a wide range of friends and relatives who are all more or less Orthodox Christians, in some cases Unitarians, and many are extremely pious, so the opportunity for her alternative ideology to find expression is correspondingly less than in the poems, in which she is writing for no one, as it were. Nevertheless, her letters feature comments suggestive of the ideas I've been illustrating from the poems in many places. I would just like to talk about another two poems which I find very interesting. The first is this: I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. In this poem, Emily Dickinson privileges poetry over prose and possibility over the mundane. Her metaphor in the first stanza of a house that stands for her poetic imagination is interesting and reminiscent of the Tao Te Ching chapter 11, which states, "We chisel out doors and windows. It is precisely in these empty spaces that we find the usefulness of the room." What Emily Dickinson means by this is that her imagination is very well founded, but infinitely receptive to experiences and information that are novel for her, and yet because she represents an example of a poetic synthesizing imagination, not alien. In the next stanza she talks about the roof and the walls of her house/imagination as being solid and not being able to be seen through, like cedars growing in a forest. This, besides the natural reference to trees in northeastern American forests, is also a reference to the biblical Song of Songs, where the female speaker talks of the beams of our house being made of cedar. This particular book of the Bible is often alluded to by Dickinson because it chimes with her life experience of unrequited love, which she mythologized into a triumphant spirituality. However, in a sidestep typical of her poetry, this human-constructed house is then located not under the vault of heaven, but under the vault of the sky, which is, in her understanding, everlasting. But in yet another humorous twist, the everlasting sky is likened to a typical New England hipped roof with gambrels. In the last stanza, Dickinson talks of spreading wide her narrow hands to gather paradise. On one level, this means gathering in sensations and information in order to write poetry, which encapsulates the Dickinsonian world, and which tries to set out her conviction that nature is heaven. But isn't it also interesting that in doing so she also describes the action, very familiar to practitioners of various Daoist practices, of gathering qi? And finally, in another poem she had written, "Embarrassment of one another and God is revelation's limit. Allowed is nothing that is chief, but still divinity dwells under seal." This is a cryptic poem, but I think that here Dickinson is contrasting revealed religion i.e. conventional Christianity, not as usual with reason, but with a mystic spirituality. Allowed in the fourth line could also mean allowed, A-L-L-O-W-E-D, and chief I think means material, important in an immediate sense. So divinity dwelling under seal could be a reference to a mystic religion directly given to the soul, as the metaphor of a seal is used several times in the Bible for secret religious knowledge, as in the book of Revelation. But its most appealing use in the Bible is in the Song of Songs. Once again, Dickinson's favourite book. Set me as a seal upon thy heart. In other words, you don't have to be converted, don't have to accept notions about God or humanity that are, or might be, counterintuitive. You already are, by virtue of being human, of that understanding naturally, which I take it is also the Daoist position. To conclude, Emily Dickinson was a formidable poet who, single-handedly, moved away from a pious 19th century New England background towards a non-monotheistic spiritual understanding of the words strikingly similar to the Daoist one. The reason that inspired poets such as her can independently light on many of the important ideas, themes and attitudes of Taoism is because Taoism is fundamentally an illumination of the basic human condition, which I write as humanity in nature. Thank you.